you to Caroline Davidson. She is the head of strategic partnership at Keychain, who are our silver tier premier providers. And then we also have Samira Niku. She is the co-founder and CEO of Better Sour. And we also have Angela Gerbers. She's just joining us. She's the sales manager at Fairmont Foods Inc. And today's topic is love at first batch, finding your perfect co-packer. And with that, I'm gonna kick it off to Caroline to jumpstart the webinar here.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. First, I want to introduce Keychain and who we are for those of you that are unfamiliar. Keychain is the largest platform for sourcing co-packers, co-manufacturers, ingredient suppliers, and packaging suppliers for North America and Europe. We are proud to support over 60,000 suppliers and brands and retailers in our network. So if you haven't checked us out, we encourage you to check out keychain.com and see how we can help you with sourcing and other needs for your innovation pipeline. Today, we're going to be talking about what makes a great co-packer, and we're going to actually break this down into 5 different categories and topics. One is going to be on fit and compatibility, what makes a great co-packer, capabilities, culture, certifications, etc. Another will be operation realities. So how do they look at capacity planning, quality, documentation, and onboarding? Some financial considerations. So when you think about minimum order quantities, you may hear us refer to that as MOQs. Payment terms, when you think about margin and cash flow. Fourth topic will be kind of any red flags and deal breakers. Are there any things that you can spot early that might be a red flag? And then from a relationship management perspective, how do we align over time and make sure that there maybe aren't silent breakups or things that we need to be aware of on both sides? So today we have 2 perspectives that we're going to bring. We're going to bring the perspective from a great emerging brand from Better Sour, and then our leaders at Fairmont Foods, who are a great co-packing partner of Keychain. So we're going to hear from kind of both sides how they think about the state of these topics. First, I'm going to pass it over to the other folks joining me today to give some background on their company and their role. I'll start with you, Samira.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I wish I had been more responsible and tuned into these kinds of panels early on when we started, because I would have learned a lot and not made so many mistakes. But Better Sour is a new sour candy brand. We make candy for adults and foodies, celebrating flavors from around the world using quality, more premium ingredients. We launched in retail mid-2023 in just 10 doors in Erewhon. At the time, it was 9, and now we're in over 4,000 doors, so growing fairly quickly. And a fun fact, Carolyn and Mitch, I don't know if you knew this, but our current co-pack or co-man, we met through Keychain, and we have a great growing partnership with them. So we have definitely benefited from your platform.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro. Angela, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, get myself unmuted there, and sorry about my
Okay.
late delay here this morning. I appreciate you having me as well. So again, my name is Angela, and I work for Fairmont Foods. We are a frozen food manufacturer. And so our primary focus is like single family serve, skillet meals, things like that. I work as a project manager, and so my main role is to work directly with incoming potential customers and guide them along the process from start to finish in getting their product launched.
Awesome. Thanks, Angela. Appreciate it. I'm sure we'll hear more about both of your business as we go through some of the questions. I'm going to start from the brand side for the most part, and then Angela, I'll turn to you and kind of hear the other side. And there are going to be some questions sprinkled in that hit for both of your businesses. But when we start with fit and compatibility, so we're starting at like a really broad scope of like how do we even match, how do we find the right cultural fit, or maybe if we have really strong brand values from a certification perspective, or somebody that's willing to work with us on testing. A smaller supply product run on like what growth could look like. I guess, Samira, I'll look to you. I know we've talked about this, but beyond the certifications and equipment, there's obviously also this like communication quality and cultural quality and like how are you kind of assessing that before you signed? And maybe were there things that you learned after the fact of scoping and learning about different co-packers that from a fit and compatibility perspective that you would advise brands on now? And how was that process for you?
That is such a good question. And I think in hindsight, and even now, we've learned that cultural compatibility is probably just as important as their technical abilities and maybe harder to diligence. I always joke that the relationship a brand has with their co-man is more like a marriage. It probably is going to be the most important partnership you have, at least in the early years of your business. It certainly has been for us. Um, that said, I will give the caveat that as a new brand, you may be in a position where you don't have that many options. Like you may be searching for months, maybe difficult now. I mean, there are, Keychain and others that can help with the search, but finding even a co-man who is willing to work with you can be a challenge. So at that point, you might have to just assess your risk tolerance and see what are you willing to work with early on, and then keep looking for a partner that may be a better fit. But in hindsight, I think of three buckets that are really important for that cultural fit. For us, first is communicativeness and how responsive they are. Are they responding to emails? Are they willing to get on calls? If you want to go visit them, the facility, are they welcoming of you doing that? Do they respond to your questions with clarity? Or do they kind of get, tossed away and fizzle at some point? And I will say that communication might be a little challenging to gauge early on because usually the person you are connecting with at your co-man initially may not be the team or operators you will be working with on a day-to-day basis. It's oftentimes could be a sales lead or their president. So I think as soon as possible, try to figure out who your point of contact there would be. And if you can go and visit and meet the team you will be working with. And then second is, are they excited about you? I mean, as a brand, it's especially when you're small, you're not going to be a big customer of theirs. You're probably not going to be spending a ton of money. So they really have to believe in your potential and where you're going to grow to and how the partnership is going to grow. So as a brand is our job to sell that vision to our co-man and make sure we're aligned there and they do actually believe it, because that's when they're going to make the exceptions. So there's going to be so many things that go wrong. People are going to have to stay late, rearrange schedules. So you want to make sure they believe in you. And then finally, I don't know what to phrase this, but something like transparency and their expertise. It's really easy to a lot of times interact with folks who just be like, yes, we can do this. Yeah, that we no problem. We'll figure out yes, yes, yes. And that can be so appealing because you want someone who's a go-getter who can fix problems with you, and that's all true. But the reality is if they're really sophisticated operators who have a lot of accountability, they're probably going to push back on some of your ideas and question them early on. Like, are you sure that ingredient that might not work with our machinery? These lead times would be ambitious. So if they're engaging in those conversations early on and being transparent about their capabilities, that could save you a lot of time and frustration down the line, because you're going to be able to problem solve with them sooner rather than figuring out, being faced with issues after the fact. So for me, these are the three most important buckets, and it's hard to gauge sometimes early on. I would say, LinkedIn, see if you have any mutual connections, or through, folks like basically like Keychain, or if they are willing to share references, ask around. In the end, you kind of just have to go with your gut
Yeah.
after evaluating all these different factors.
Yeah, that's super important. And one thing that we also talk about internally is, even the extending the olive branch of let's make sure we have a mutual NDA in place. And then if you're happy to share or you are able to share one or two references, that can always be helpful. But what I'm hearing from you is like communication off the bat is really, really important. It helps build trust really quickly and that they care about you or care about the interest of a potential new client. The second is just like the ability of believing in the vision and kind of being co-invested together from a interest, time. Um, and then the third is also just overt transparency, even if that means we cannot do this, or you should be aware of this, or if you're going to scale two, three times what this initial order is, like here are some things to think about. Sounds like a lot of like back and forth on education as a brand entering a new co-packer is like helps build that trust even more. So sounds like that from the beginning is really important. Um, Angela, now I'm going to come to you on the co-packer side because
Yeah,
obviously you're going to hear this from clients
you
all the
know,
time. And for you all, when
absolutely.
you're evaluating a brand, what are some of the early signals in a conversation that really allow you to say, like, this could really be of interest for us, is where that mutual investment on both sides comes into play? Because obviously you're going to qualify and disqualify people often, sometimes maybe based on size, based on opportunity, whatever that is. But what are some of those early signs that you all are evaluating?
Yeah, so everything she said is absolutely true. So we love it when somebody reaches out and they want to come visit with us. They want to be on site. They want to see what we have to offer. That's very important. That shows us they're genuinely looking towards, pursuing their dream of turning this into a project that's going to hit the shelves. So we love that part of it. Like I said, like she said, ask the questions early on. I think the biggest thing and the hardest one we deal with is somebody will come to us and say, "Hey, we've got this thing. Hey, what is it going to cost? Can you tell me tomorrow what it's going to cost? For us to make that. And that's kind of, to me, a kind of a red flag. You're right to pricing. I would hope that if you are looking into getting into this market, that you've already done that background and that research. What does it cost? What is your ingredient cost? What is your packaging? And a realistic, what is an ideal waste? A lot of people come back and they're like, well, oh, we didn't add waste into that, or we didn't calculate in, all those extra things that are going to cost, to make that product. So we want the person to have done a little bit of their homework before they come to us. And on-site and fit us, we welcome them. So that's a
Yeah.
great starting way to build that relationship. It was like she said, it is a relationship. It is you talk when you're starting from nothing to execution. That you're talking every day, you're working through things, you're coming up with the scenarios like, if you try this, it's going to save you some money, but it's not going to jeopardize the quality of your product. So
Hmm.
that's why we're here. We
Yeah.
don't want, I've seen people fail because they have such high expectations of all unique ingredients and thinking we're going to sell into this market, and so they end up paying a lot to get in, and then the reward doesn't come at the end
Mm.
for them. So
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point on the reward not coming, sometimes that impacts maybe a expected margin that
yeah,
they were expecting to hit. And then you
yeah,
get with distributors and retailers, right? That margin goes
correct,
down and down and
correct,
down.
correct,
A lot of
correct.
startup brands are working with brokers and other folks that are cutting into
Correct.
that. And so to your point, coming with doing some of that research and understanding that from the beginning is really important. But also maybe establishing like what are the values as a brand that are the highest priority. And so you can still maintain high quality ingredients, but what doesn't also sacrifice margin? Because at the end of the day, we need to
Yep,
make sure revenue and margin are
yep,
positive so we can continue to
yep.
sell. So yeah, that's really helpful. I'm going to move on to our next topic for operational and a reality, which talks kind of about lead times and capacity planning. Samira, when you're working with or have, either vetted co-manufacturers and co-packers. We use that term, I should have opened up with interchangeably. So we'll use co-packers as a general term here as like any manufacturing partner that makes and packages your product. But when you're looking at kind of like quality standards or you're having that discussion about even capacity planning or the documentation that they require, did you know where to start? Like, how did you begin with onboarding? Did you know what questions? Like, can you kind of walk me through what that experience has been and how you might either have done it differently or advice that you would have?
Yeah, I think we learned, I mean, starting out, we now in hindsight, we just didn't know anything. And there's so many questions we didn't ask. But I think first and foremost is figure out what kind of, like broadly speaking, relationship you want to have. If you want it to be fully turnkey, if you want your manufacturer to be sourcing everything for you within, certain specifications you provide, or you plan on sourcing yourself or some kind of hybrid. Are you do you need any kind of R&D help? Do they need to have an in-house R&D team, or at least folks they work close, third parties they work closely with and can bring in? And then is it just going to be manufacturing, or want to make sure they can also package the product, or is there flexibility where you can send the manufactured goods to a co-packer to package it? So I think this is like broadly speaking, knowing what kind of, because some may not have all these capabilities. For example, they may not have certain packaging or bottling requirements you may have. I think going in, I think part of your question was like anything, what we kind of had like before we go in with the relationship and when we needed, making sure we had our formula, at least even the the third party or R&D formula, and making sure they had worked on formulas that were similar and were comfortable working with those ingredients. Any packaging requirements we have like they can work with. And then, QA, like testing what we needed, what that would look like, the cadence, if they had third parties they work with or whatnot. And then just any general principles that were, I would say, even like almost like red lines for us. Like, for example, if we wanted to ensure that it was not an exclusive partnership, maybe some manufacturers will require working with them that they be your exclusive manufacturer. If that's a red line, knowing and communicating that early on, or around formula ownership, if there are any improvements, making sure that the brand, you are the owners of that, if that's, a requirement. So I think there's certain principles and questions kind of broadly of the nature of the relationship that we went in, and then kind of it trickles into, demand and capacity and kind of what their capabilities are once we get past those kind of bigger overarching themes.
Yeah, that makes sense. As a second follow-up question to that, let's say that you're aligned on a lot of these capacity planning and like the quality and onboarding, what that process looks like. But then when you think about any potential hidden costs that you might want to mitigate with in terms of like the downtime or maybe protecting a margin that you've set up, like how are you planning for that? And is that an ongoing back and forth dialogue? And Angela, I'll come to you with that question next. But Samira, I'll give you the first chance to answer.
How are we trying to protect our margins? That's the question, and how we work with our
Yeah,
manufacturer.
and how do you think about capacity planning in that regard? Because obviously you're not a certain size of brands are not going to be running machines 24/7. And so it's a bit more of a puzzle of how often do we run, what are the cost implications of if we run every month versus every quarter, and how do we space that out? And kind of like how do you work with a co-packer on some of that scheduling?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the biggest challenge as a smaller brand, figuring that out, because you may not even have the retail commitments for, to do that kind of planning. So, you may need to earlier on work with a manufacturer that perhaps is a little more nimble and flexible in the timings, be able to adjust as needed. Of course, that kind of flexibility sometimes may come with more informal processes that can more easily break down at scale. But working with a manufacturer that perhaps more nimble, I mean, always if you can lump together similar SKUs or pack outs and ensure your productions are as big as possible at a given time, that will help with margins. And just one thing I want to say is making sure that when you're onboarding with a manufacturer, get tiered pricing to know like what the different price breaks are, because maybe you'll realize like, okay, if I can just make like 50,000 more of this, I will see some significant margin savings on my margin. So doing that, lumping together if you can. I know cash can be difficult in order to have a bigger production and put in that deposit. I found like the first production is, obviously you don't know each other as well, so that it makes sense. The manufacturer has to protect their own margins too, like will not necessarily be flexible on payment terms, but sometimes they are. But definitely once you start developing that trust and that relationship, they may be open to having more creative payment terms. Like maybe if they are sourcing for you, you pay a certain percentage to source the materials, and the rest of it kind of later when the product is produced, or some kind of creative solution. Again, this all goes back to being very collaborative and communicative with your manufacturer, and both kind of believing in the partnership and what the potential of it is. Because I found if they believe in you, then they are definitely more willing and interested to engage in some kind of creative solution.
Yeah, that's super helpful and some good little tidbits in there of reminders. especially for those that haven't gone through the working with the manufacturer before. Angela, on your side, kind of as a follow-up to that, when we think about lead times, capacity planning, some changes in demand that may come ideally last minute with maybe a big PO, or even on your side with capacity planning, because you guys are obviously running a large operation. Like, how do you
Yep.
think about that? And how do you advise brands on realistic lead times and capacity planning and how they should be thinking about it or advising them on it?
For us, the more homework that the customer has done on their end, the faster we can move things along. And with that being said, we're pretty transparent. With any business, we might go through different times of the year when we're busier than another, and so our lead times might be different. And so hopefully the co-man that you select is open with that, letting you know what those lead times are. Sometimes we could turn something around in a 6 week period. Next time it might be 12 weeks. So it's trying to do the best forecasting you can do for your co-man. That's so important. So a lot of the we actually work in frozen, so versus like like she's talking about candy and stuff like that. So we have to contract vegetables, all these kind of things that come into play. And so all of that is about timing. When do the vegetables
Mhm.
contracted out? So the longer the lead time we have for things, the better we are, and the better we can um, produce things for you guys. I get
Mhm.
a lot of times where I'll ask somebody for a forecast on their projects and they just don't know. And so then it trickles down from there. If they don't know, I don't know. And then I can't give my suppliers, the information that they need, So then that's when you
Mhm.
run into issues with sourcing and finding what you need. So, the better you can forecast what you got going on in the future of your product, the better for us. So.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're working with a new brand that's onboarding, are there any ways that you see SMB size brands that might slow down the process, or that anything that could make it more efficient rather than just fast communication? I know you said like bringing some
Yeah,
of their own research to the table, but are there other things that you see
yeah.
that might be like a common theme?
Yeah, so we will have one customer that, and we are, for our particular, as being a co-man, we're open to both. We'll have people that bring a concept and say, we want to take this concept. Can you help us build some formulas? The fastest turnaround is if people have those formulas already commercialized, from cooked to a frozen, so we're in a frozen category, so that they're ready to go. They bring us those formulas. They've already, checked them all off. They're solid, and then we just start picking it up and then we make it from there. So
Hmm.
and communication early on, what it's going to take, some people forget, stabilizers, things like that to make their food stable from cooked to frozen and then frozen to cooked again, so it's just things like that
Yeah.
we're here to work with them to get through that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm going to jump to the financial piece now with some MOQs and payment terms. Samir, you already touched on a little bit of this on the flexibility. But when you think about your order quantities from a retail velocity or maybe a planning perspective, um, are there any additional tidbits that you'd share on like creative structures that you guys have thought through, or does it really come down to cash flow that of what you're able to stock on hand? Obviously, you're a shelf stable product, which helps in terms of what you can do with that. But any other insight into like financially how you've planned around that? Because um, my partner is in the beverage industry. I know we've talked about this, and they get a PO from a big retailer, and they're like, "Can you be on shelf in 6 weeks?" And there's a lot of scrambling that may happen because you want to make it work, but how do you balance what might be coming up from a retail buyer meeting and when you need to be on shelf with kind of your cash flow of what you have going on? So, how do you guys think about that? And obviously, you've grown significantly in the last 2.5 to 3 years, and there's probably been ebbs and flows of that velocity change. So, how do you guys think about that from a planning capacity side?
Yeah, it's a challenging one, and I can tell you, even a few years in, it's still a challenge because by nature, when you're growing, there's just so much unpredictables and things coming in that you want to be so much prepared, but you don't want to tie up too much cash in inventory. Of course, as you get bigger, there's PO financing and other like financing options. But I mean, we're a shelf stable product, so we realized early on that we have some time to take the risk. And we had our first production and launched it at Expo West, the product, even before we had any retail commitments. So we took that risk. It ended up paying off. We did get the commitments, but it is always going to be a risk. I would say getting that tiered pricing so you know what, if there's something like a minimum that you can live with margin wise, and maybe early on you don't want to think too much like my margin isn't that great. Like if you have some cash cushion, look at where I can get to. Like I can, if, assuming I'm going to be growing the way I want to grow, this is what my margins are going to be looking like in the year. So especially if you're fundraising, that is like an important story to tell. So just seeing what cash you have. And then if you have like work with a co-man multiple times, again, like they might be willing to show some flexibility on the payment terms, but it is really an art, is more than probably, I guess there's some science to it. Yeah, it really depends on flexibility. And at one point I want to make that does connect to this and also the capacity planning issue is if you really are not in a position to plan far, far ahead to have these productions because you just don't know what is going on with your business. An important conversation to have with the manufacturer early on is not just what their total capacity is, but how much capacity they have for you in the foreseeable future and what the lead times look like. Are the lead times just the time that it takes to get materials, or are they like booked through the year, only have like a couple weeks in a certain quarter? Because if they have more flexibility, lead times, and have the time, then you do have yourself that flexibility to put in smaller POs and kind of take that smaller risk on the productions. But make sure you fully understand their capacity from the totality of the production. And I'll give the story of us. We were working once, we no longer work with them, a manufacturer where and this was on us for not realizing this, they told us their total capacity, how much of our product they had capacity to make at a given time. What we did not realize until it was a little too late is that they actually had the capacity and they made the number and quantity of gummies we needed, but then they did not have a lot of packaging capabilities. So even though this was made, they only had a very, very tiny capacity to package on a daily basis. So we ended up having to wait weeks to get that full production because their packaging capacity wasn't where we needed to be. And we did not realize this. When they told us we have capacity, we're like, all right, they have ability to make this within this amount of time. We did not realize that until it was too late. So make sure you fully understand the spectrum of production, what their capacity looks like.
Yeah. And that's a good thing to note is differentiating how do you define capacity? And is capacity just making the physical product? Does capacity include packaging? Yes or no? Does lead time, to Angela's point, also include the sourcing of the upfront materials? Like how are we defining lead time and capacity and maybe agreeing on a joint definition of what that means? Because it sounds like there's some of those surprises where you don't want to be surprised if you know that you've got an expected run coming up. Angela, on your side on this, like, what kind of like pricing discussions or conversations do you wish brands were having maybe with you more often? This kind of goes to Samira's point of like, do you ever feel like there's like misaligned expectations or they're like, oh, I didn't understand that? Or are there like clarifying questions they could ask in the upfront when it comes to pricing, MOQs, or it could be capacity or margin related too?
Yeah, just touching on that subject, there's some things to realize. If you're coming to us and we might set up terms, negotiate terms, maybe it's going to be 15 days or it's 10 days and then we'll give you a 2% off or something like that. There's a lot of different ways you can set up. If you're a national customer, you're probably going to get longer lead times because that's just what happens when you're a big name, and you're a small name, you're probably going to get shorter terms. With that being said, you also have to take in the fact that if you're going to get into a national retailer, that retailer probably is not going to pay you for 120 to 150 days. So you have to take all that into account. You have to pay your co-man, but you're not getting paid for a long time on the other end, so it's all those things. And so as we take on new customers, it becomes a thing that we want to minimize our risk as a co-man, to look at that company, how long have they been around, and if they haven't been around and there's no credit out there, to be able to look at, number one, we would have to believe in your brand too. We'd have to say, hey, we think that's a project that will do very well. Hopefully they've done their market research on that as well, and then from there, like she mentioned, maybe we'd be willing to take it on, but you would have to pay up front. Maybe you have to pay to order the ingredients so that we're not going to take that risk on, because like we always said, nobody wants to chase money. And so it just becomes a upfront. That's one of the most upfront conversations I have with people, is just the money situation. So I try not to be shy about it, because it's a fact of business. So and then
we know a lot of, we know a lot of brands, to Samira's point, are you also are trying to be transparent and maybe doing fundraising to cover some of that cost that's changing with margins and manufacturing. So that's really helpful too.
And even if you're a new to the business, you talked about lead times, maybe I couldn't take on, somebody that's looking for 10 million pounds this year, but I have capacity to take on somebody that's got 500,000 pounds, so you look at that. So just because capacity for one guy maybe doesn't work means I can fit you in now, knowing it's an emerging brand, and we're willing to take the risk on that. So
that's a good point. It's just because you're
a startup.
Exactly. Just because you're smaller doesn't necessarily mean that you can't work with a really efficient or larger manufacturer that may have more flexibility, because you actually might fit well in between the existing capacity planning. I think sometimes we get brands that jump to, oh, I just need somebody that can do small MOQs, and they rule out like anybody that's larger than a certain size or a certain square footage, because there's kind of an assumption that it's more expensive, or they don't have time for me, or they only work with these big brands and I don't have the payment flexibility to do that, or the planning. And so I think that's a good takeaway too, is don't discredit some of all of the options in the market for your potential product type. Because at the end of the day, you guys want to fill all of your capacity as much as you can, right?
Absolutely.
So it's good for both sides.
Absolutely. Yep.
When it comes to maybe some like red flags, or where your, as I like to say, spidey senses go up, Samira, what are some of the, maybe like if it's a facility tour, or like early negotiations, is there anything that you found that determines if somebody like isn't the right partner? I mean, that could be like difficulty scheduling a tour, or oh, we don't need to come on site. I mean, like, are there any things, whether that's communication or body language, or any other red flags that you might think about to give advice to for brands?
Yeah. For us, honestly, a red flag usually comes from having a super high expectation really fast, and then just wanting to go straight to what's it going to cost them, So if I always worry about if they're going straight to price and not to what we can do in our capabilities, that maybe that we're not the right fit, because then I worry about the money part of it. So
yeah, that's fair. Samira, what about on your side?
Yeah, I mean, and then that goes to whether there's interest from both parties to really look at this as a partnership that they're willing to invest in. And, part of that is, how do both of you deal with disagreements? Do the conversations become hostile, or does it seem like it's going to be collaborative to find a solution? Of course, communication have to, have similar communication styles and expectations. Are there points of contacts at the manufacturer where if you need an answer, you can find it? Or is it just going to be trying to like call different people? It takes days. Obviously, that doesn't make you feel safe. Having, responding to questions with clarity. And, when you visit, how do folks there treat each other? How do colleagues talk about each other? Do they elevate each
Mhm.
other or put maybe some colleagues down, throw them under the bus? When you visit, do they have very strict protocols when you're there, or they, treat you very like informally because you don't want a recall situation? So it's
Yeah.
like a combination of things that, you'll come away like at various discussions. Like, does this, manufacturer partner like make you feel safe, or are you
Hmm.
now like thinking of all these things that you should be thinking about anyway, but like to give you anxiety about, oh my gosh, I get a sense that this X,
Hmm.
Y, and Z could go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. It's it kind of goes back to a lot of things in life where part of it is information gathering and really looking at it from a quantitative perspective, but the other part is that gut and that kind of like emotional connection. And um, Angela, I know you've mentioned that quite a few times too. So it seems like there's a little bit of a yin and yang with the vetting process. Um, for our last topic here, we're talking about overall relationship management. And um, Samira, I'll start with you. Once you're in production and there's kind of this ongoing cadence of ho- as your business is going to change often, right? You might have a PO coming up, your capacity planning may change. How are you staying in communication with them? How much information are you comfortable sharing? Um, how much of that is just going through somebody in operations or coming through you as a co-founder directly? Like, is that kind of a joint communication plan internally? Is like I know that's a kind of a broad scope, but once you're in a relationship, how are you determining what that cadence and communication looks like? And then how do you, maybe if it isn't working out, because it sounds like you've had that situation, like how are you addressing that and thinking about the risk internally with switching versus like externally? When do you make that decision?
Yeah, I think what we've learned is that the more and we can keep in consistent communication, the better, and not just during productions, but even leading up to productions, making sure everything, materials have been delivered, everything's set up. But when it's in production, and our productions can take a long time, and now it's a point where they happen often. So we end up basically we're in touch with our manufacturing partners almost every week, but during production, especially making sure we have that weekly call. And we're a small team, so by virtue of that, plus I'm the co-founder that oversees more the ops sides of things. So me and our head of ops are on almost every call with our co-man and want to make sure that they know how invested we are, how much we're paying attention. And there's, something I know we could do more of, and I couldn't recommend more, is to visiting your co-man as much as possible when in doubt. And if you have the resources, visit. So they know you're invested, you're there, you're seeing things as they're happening. I am someone that I need to be able to text and call. I'm old school, so having points of contact where, multiple times during the week, make text, call if there's things that come up. But having a regular standing call in the books, I found can be a big game changer because we've had instances where we're like, all right, things to be going well, maybe a few weeks, not paying attention, and then that's when, a good manufacturer, I think a very accountable one won't do this, will communicate it. But I think if you're working with one that maybe may have some less than ideal practices, is you can get pushed aside. They may start prioritizing someone else for a week or two, and you may not realize it until after a fact. So making sure
Hmm.
that you are in constant communication and know what is happening, if any issues come up, any hiccups, that you know immediately, rather than when it's too late, when you thought you're going to get a production and now you're going to have to let your customer know that it's going to be a few weeks late.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. Before I jump to you, Angela, on a response there, Lindley, I know you've asked a couple questions. We'll get to those once we finish this topic. Just wanted to let you know they're coming. Angela, on your side too, when you think about once you're in a relationship and you've got maybe some more long-term brand partnerships and maybe some that have churned or maybe there's been some friction. I mean, maybe that's some of the points that Samira brought up of just like having things on a standing basis. But how do you define maybe keeping that relationship in a good standing point? Does it all come down to communication, or are there maybe some other things that you found that are helpful?
Do you know, communication is great, but that whole relationship, that's what it comes down to. It is a relationship with our customers and with Coleman. You have that relationship. It's a trusting thing. Once you develop that relationship, if there's a hiccup in the road, it makes it a lot easier to have that conversation with them. Like, hey, we didn't get this ingredient in, we can't run it, but we can do this, we can pivot, move you up here. Does this work? All those conversations that are going to happen in our world, are a lot easier when you have that relationship. I highly recommend making that visit, come to the plant, get to know the people, get to make sure you're comfortable with the person that's on your account. It makes a world of difference.
Yeah.
It's so much
Yeah.
easier to pivot anything.
And Carolyn,
That's
can I add one
helpful.
more
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah.
Kind of related to your question of how much you share. I think this is, obviously you don't want to spill like everything there. Some things brand will want to keep to themselves. You don't want to share everything, but assuming you have the NDA and there's trust there, I mean, share if there's any, if a production is for a particular big account, or if there's a big opportunity, like, hey, I know we don't have a lot of lead time, but you might have materials left over. Can we like accommodate this? Because this could be like for this retailer, it's a test. If it goes well, it's going to be massive business for both of us. So communicating if like certain changes or urgencies, why they exist. I think, and we've learned that our great co-man partners have been willing to work with us to the extent they can. So going to Angela's point,
Yeah.
it is like a partnership. And so part of that, you got to, communicate some of these things as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not just sounds like it's on both sides of the over communication about from the brand side of like, here's where our state of our business is, here's what's coming up, and giving them a little bit of peek behind the hood so that because you're both equally invested and going to benefit from that. But on Angela's point, it's if you're in constant communication and maybe even if there are difficult conversations, but you've established trust in the beginning because you have that cadence and that rapport already built up, then ideally there is, even if maybe it's not the right fit long term, it's more mutual of moving on than it is disruptive or combative. And there aren't surprises along the way. So there's kind of healthy ways to do it throughout the process. I'm going to jump to some of the questions. Thank you guys so much for all of your great responses on those topics. Lindley, I know you've got 2 questions, and then we'll open it up if there's any additional Q&A across any of the attendees. But one that was asked was defining co-manufacturers versus co-packers. And I know I'd mentioned this, but I'm just going to use an example to clarify. I would say in general, and I guess Mitch here, my colleague who has spent majority of his career in the manufacturing and private brand space and is an expert in this field. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, but most of the industry uses these 2 words interchangeably. So you may hear a brand say, this is, I work with a co-manufacturer, I work with a co-packer, and they may describe those as doing the same thing. So that's one thing to consider. The second thing is that on a more technical level, a co-manufacturer, I'm just going to use Samira's Better Sour Gummies as an example. Co-manufacturer is manufacturing, so literally making that product and making the gummy products. They may order the ingredients or you may send them the ingredients and then they make the gummy itself, but they may not necessarily package it and put it into the final package and seal that. They might just make the gummy, but some co-manufacturers make the gummy and put it in packaging. So a co-manufacturer can kind of be this umbrella of a lot of different joint capabilities. If you get a little bit more specific on co-packers, while some people may interchangeably use that in the same umbrella term as co-manufacturer, a lot of times a co-packer is communicating with your co-manufacturer who's made the gummy product, then that is going to a logistics company or the co-manufacturer is shipping that to a co-packer. And the co-packer has the ability to actually put those gummies into a package and they are sealing up and packaging as a co-packer. As the word insinuates, they're packaging it as a final product. And then you work with them on either if they have the capacity, they can hold that product, or they might ship it to a distribution center, a warehouse, or another logistics center where you're kind of holding that inventory, you're shipping it straight to an account. So hopefully that helps provide some clarity of what we mean when we say those terms. Angela, a question for you that came in is, if somebody is in the frozen category and they're looking for their first co-manufacturer, are there any geographic considerations, particularly because this is frozen? So I think this might actually apply to kind of anything that's frozen or refrigerated, anything that requires like a cold supply chain, how much should geographic considerations be taken into place?
Well, we are centrally located, so we're the perfect co-man, honestly, because we can ship East Coast, West Coast, and we're sitting right in the middle. So it makes it really good for ours. Now, if depending on the type of product that you're launching, let's say Southern cuisine, and you're located in the state of Washington, yeah, that, and you're going to ship everything down south, that definitely would take that in consideration, because freight's going to cost you a lot. And then same thing, warehousing, wherever you're going to warehouse your product as well, until it hits the shelves, until they start pulling stuff. So something to take into consideration.
Okay, because there's other factors and cost involved beyond the co-manufacturer, right? There's the 3PL or the distribution center. There's like 2 or 3 layers beyond that. So to your point earlier in the conversation is, how do you kind of do the research of figuring out what your supply chain would look like and what are the costs along the way, so that, maybe if your company is the best in terms of MOQ price and quality, is it worth the additional cost for the shipping to somewhere geographically versus another one that may not have the same quality standards that are in a different location?
Most co-mans are like FOB, so basically once it leaves our thing, it's up to you. Everything else, you're paying for the shipping to ship it out of here. You're paying for your warehousing. You're paying for that transfer from the warehouse into the next, so.
Yeah. Would you just define for the group FOB in case some folks aren't familiar with that term?
Freight on board. So, yeah.
Okay.
So, yep. So great. Basically, you're going to pay for any freight costs that it'll take for you to leave our facility.
Yeah, those are not built in. Some people might think, oh, because you're the one sending it, maybe that's built in, but that's a good thing for brands to keep in consideration, especially for refrigerated or frozen.
Correct.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I don't see any other questions, but I know we've got quite a few participants in the call. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A section or the chat. We'll wait just a minute or two if anybody adds anything, and if not, then we'll wrap up. Answered.
Okay. Hi, Caroline. I would like to ask a question.
Sure.
And my question is, I know you guys already talked about this, but what strategies help maintain long-term alignment in relationship to avoid that silent breakup? Do you guys have top tips that we could possibly share with the members here?
It sounds like, and correct me here, Samir and Angela, it sounds like proactive communication and pre-setting up either weekly or bi-weekly touch bases is a big one to consider. Another one has been information transparency and building an in-person rapport from the beginning. So visiting on site, regularly visiting, knowing who your points of contact are, is really important, as well as being transparent on business for each of your businesses from the beginning. So that's the brand sharing a bit more about, here's what we have coming up, here's some big accounts and opportunities, and giving a little peek behind the hood, as well as from the manufacturer's perspective. Here's where you could fit into our capacity planning. Here's transparency about things that you may not be financially planning for right now. Here's things to think about with your formulation or scalability if we were to double or triple the MOQ that you want to think about. It sounds like a lot of rapport building and trust in the beginning is really helpful. Samira and Angela, do you guys have anything beyond those 3?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. It's a good co-man is going to be as open as they can with you about the start to finish. I love building that relationship with a potential new partner, figuring out what they need, helping them, look at different ways of how we could do their product and save them money. Packaging is a huge thing. The more packaging you buy, the better you save on things. But if it's a risk in the beginning, then I'm going to say you're going to I suggest you pay more for that package in the beginning, and then you work up to that in the end. We're going to guide you through that whole process. And you mentioned about breakup. Get to know your co-man and be comfortable with who you select as your co-man, and not just choose one because that was the only one available. You have to have that relationship, because if you don't trust us, it could, you're not going to get very far. I mean, honestly, I've never had a breakup with anybody. Maybe their sales went down and we lost an SKU, or we picked up another one, but um, I've never had a breakup, I guess you would say, over a disagreement. We work very hard because we want your business. We want you to do well. If you do well, we're going to do well. And so, that is our goal.
Yeah,
I agree with all of that. And then as part of that, making sure you have that continual discussion of what both of your growth plans are.
Yeah.
As the brand grows, ensuring Co-Man has the capacity both in volume and, other matters, organization, whatnot, to also grow as well or accommodate it. So just, part of that all goes back to communication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And absolutely, with the growth, you might come to us and want to launch 2 items. Well, we'll want to launch those 2 items. And now we want to help you launch 4 more. What can we do? What categories can we get you into, that we can expand what you're already doing?
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ladies.
Great.
Thank you again for this valuable information. And thank you to all our members who joined us today. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email education@specialtyfood.com. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day to all of you. Take care.
Great. Thank
Thanks for
you.
having
Bye-bye.
us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.